Hey, I'm making this mostly for Ben Wandflu, but it might be useful for one or two other students. But anyway, sorry to that student for the Zoom mix-up. I don't know what happened, because I got emails around those times, which I should have checked.
I need Violet and Sophia Shane for front pickup, please. Violet and Sophia Shea.
But you can ask your class. We checked the little lobby, the waiting room area, a couple times in the first 10 minutes, and I didn't see you. So, anyway, all we really went over was some introductory stuff. I was talking about how we're going to keep tabs on three specific cities this semester.
I am now going to read the next 20 names.
Yes, three different cities that we're keeping tabs on. Ephesus in Asia Minor or Turkey is part of the Roman Empire at some point. Massilia, or eventually Marseille in France, which is obviously a modern day city, but it goes back to ancient Roman and Roman Empire times, and Alexandria, which we have talked about before in class. I use these kind of three cities for today to make this point that none of these are cities on the Italian peninsula, but they're all part of the Roman Empire's territory at various times, and different historical figures and events that we're going to talk about this semester will take place in those cities. So, kind of just a way to kind of refresh people in terms of the history of ancient Rome. And then we start to refresh ourselves on parts of speech. So we talk about how nouns belong to five different declensions, which each have their own purpose, obviously. This is something that's going to be really familiar to students who are now in their third year. But those endings change to reflect those different cases, and that is something that English speakers have trouble with because it is not really a characteristic of our language, though our pronouns do something similar. Verbs will change their endings in order to reflect person, number, and tense, right? So tense and number might be something we're used to in English, but we don't always stop to think about the person of verbs in English because we are not building them into the ending of verbs. We are clarifying the person by spelling out the subject in very direct terms, which ancient Romans didn't have to do. That information was potentially built into the ending of the verb, right? We all know this. Also, something we got towards the end of the quarantine era last spring was that we have so much information about verbs, so many forms of verbs, that at this point we can do something called a synopsis, which is this Greek term that people use nowadays just to mean summary, and it basically means summary in this context too. It's a summary of like all the forms of the verbs. So we have access to all of these forms minus the very bottom part of this, which is the subjunctive mood, something we will not get till maybe the very end of this year. Sorry for the interruptions. But yeah, we won't get subjunctive till the very end. But we have everything above that last part at the bottom, which includes the middle part, which is the passive voice. That's something we got, I believe, at the beginning of quarantine era. So it's something we're definitely going to want to review. We just brushed up on adjectives. Adjectives in Latin tend to be very simple. They will become more complex soon when we get comparative and superlative adjectives. But yeah, often, early on, the adjective endings was identical to the noun ending. That is not always the case, though, when you have, say, a third declension adjective modifying a second declension, which, speaking of declensions, I didn't quite stop to say that we will have the fourth and fifth declension. We'll review those since those were things we went over during quarantine. Yeah. So let's see. We also have. I'm just clicking through a lot of these right now. Prepositions, right? So you can pause the screen to take these notes, but those are the ablative ones there. Insigne, cum de, ab, ex, pro, sub. And there's at least one that I forgot. And the accusative ones in, which with an accusative will be toward, ad, ante, post, contra, and inter. Yep. Adverbs are super simple. Okay, this is just kind of rushing up on what they actually are in English because we haven't really done anything with them to make them more complicated in Latin. Pronouns, we have a bunch of them. That's why I'm joking around that the students kind of hate them. These first three, if you're kind of moving left to right, top to bottom, are personal pronouns. Well, I'm sorry, just the top row are the personal pronouns. So, ego, me, mihi, meme is first person, singular pronouns. Nos nostrum, nobis, etc. are the plural versions. Tui, tibi, tete are second person singular. Vos, vestrum, plural of those. And then those third person personal pronouns like he, she, it, or is, ea, id, are probably the trickiest to kind of keep track of since there's one for each of the three genders. On the second row, we have our demonstratives, and also on the last row, the bottom row to the left, we have ista, istud, which is kind of the same as illid. And then over quarantine, or I think right before quarantine, we got relative pronouns, qui, qui, quad. So that is like who or which or that, or sometimes whom or whose, if it's genitive or accusative. And these can also function as interrogative pronouns or adjectives, which are just one of those same words, who, that, which are used to ask questions. So, and then we started to brush up a little bit. So the very first, the green information here at the top is for chapter 17 brush up, which that is the relative pronoun that I was just talking about, qui, qui, quad, who or which or that. So we have this example here, fortis vir, comma, qui est frater mei, comma, bonus miles est. And no one remembered miles. I think we got that right at the end. It means soldier. But if you want to pause here and try to work through this, I had the students identify what was the main clause versus the relative clause. The commas here make it very easy to do, but a lot of the times we will not have commas, so you need to be able to identify it without the commas, in which case you just kind of run into a qui, qui, quad, realize that you're in a relative clause, and then at that point, the relative clause will need its own verb, and it usually has a couple more words beyond just that as well. So, qui est frater mei is the relative clause there. So, fortis vir just means like the brave man, and I'm going to click ahead to the answer now if you want to pause it and work through any more of it, but the brave or strong man, who is my brother, right, that's the relative clause, is a good soldier. So the main clause is just the brave man is a good soldier, but it's interrupted by this relative clause, which again, it's very clear here because of the commas, but we will not always have those commas to rely on. The blue information is chapter 18 and 21 brush up, and that is passive verbs. So remember we get those brand new endings, which will come up in its own slide in a second, but that's like ris, tour, more, mini, intor. And that's when somebody is verbed as opposed to somebody verbs something, right? It's when a verb is happening to the subject as opposed to the subject carrying out an action on its own. So magister et discipula docentur, and docentur is a third person plural passive verb ending. That's going to be, and I'm going to click ahead if you want to try to figure it out on your own, but the subject is magister and discipula, so it's going to be the teacher and students are taught. So yeah, that is something where I'm going to keep reviewing. I'm telling the students that we're going to be reviewing a lot next week. I'm going to try to kind of cram in like a couple chapters worth of review in the first 5 to 10 minutes of class every day next week. But it's going to be something that really takes all month to brush up on the stuff, especially since it was stuff that was covered during quarantine, which obviously isn't the best time to learn as in last spring. Hopefully now we know how to use technology in a more effective way, though I am proving to still have tons of technical issues. The orange information here is chapter 19, and that is the perfect passive, which is just kind of expanding on the passive verbs, but it is perfect passive, so it's going to be like have been verbed. So discipula is doctus est. The perfect passive verb is in two parts. It's doctus and est. You're taking a fourth principal part, which in this case is doctum, and then you're adding it to a form of sum esse. And so you think it might be like the student is taught, but that would just be discipulus doctor. Since perfect passive, the student has been taught. And that's kind of weird, but as soon as you recognize that the fourth principal part of the verb is being used, you know that you are in the perfect system. And then last but not least is the fourth and fifth declension, which I know they're very small right here, but you can Google them or find them in chapter 20, 22 respectively, and we'll brush up on those. And I realize that orange color is not the best color in terms of legibility. But fourth declension all the way to the right is all about the letter U, especially the long US ending, which is showing up in genitive, nominative plural, and accusative plural. And then fifth declension is really similar to third declension. It likes the letters E and I, and it's basically the same as third declension with the exception of the genitive singular. And once we, that's not quite enough review. That's too cursory to be counted as a full review of those chapters. But once you brush up on those, we should be able to push into chapter 23 and beyond just fine. But yeah, brushing up on Latin after a long summer is always a bit of a process. And these are those passive endings I was talking about. Ris, tour, more, mini, and tour. I am verbed, you are verbed, it is verbed, etc. Not too bad. And remember, if I ask you about the voice of these verbs, it is passive. We never talked about the voice of verbs until we got passive verbs, because up till that point, all the verbs were active. And that's about all we did on this day. These days are really short this first week. or the classes rather, they're like 37 minutes because we're doing assembly schedule all week and we're doing, yeah, so they're shortened days. And next or tomorrow, Friday, I mean, you might be hearing this on Friday, is going to be, I'm going to hand out the books. We might do a little review, so there may or may not be a video for tomorrow, but I probably won't try to do a Zoom because we're going to take a whole like 10 or 15 minutes to pass out books and stuff. But I'll keep you posted as always, and sorry again about the technical
I am
issues.
now going to read the
Goodbye,
next
and
20
thank you.
names in